Hello, my name is Emma, and today I'm going to be giving you guys some high fantasy recommendations for urban fantasy readers. Now, I am an urban fantasy reader, which is something I've mentioned quite a few times on this channel. I've read high fantasy, I've liked some high fantasy, I haven't liked some high fantasy. It's just not my preference, it's not my cup of tea. Normally if I'm reading a book and I pick it up and don't realize it's high fantasy, as soon as it hits me, I'm like, oh shit, I'm not gonna like this book anymore. I just find them intimidating and overwhelming, and I don't grasp some of the things in the books as well as I do with normal urban fantasy or other genres in general. So I wanted to make a video talking about a couple of high fantasy reads that I have read, have enjoyed, or would recommend to people who are looking to expand and read more high fantasy. Just as a disclaimer, you've probably heard all of these books before, especially if you watch a lot of BookTube. I'm not going to be giving you guys some like underground, underrated, unknown high fantasy books because I don't read enough to know those kind of books. I read the popular ones and I either like them or I don't like them. So if you're a high fantasy reader that came to this video for recommendations, I'm sorry, you have most definitely probably already read all of the books I'm going to be talking about. But if you are an urban fantasy reader or just somebody who's trying to get into more fantasy in general, you probably have heard all of these books before, especially if you're on BookTube. So you may have read some of these books to try and give high fantasy a shot, or there might be others on this list that you've heard about and kind of have considered trying but weren't really sure just because the genre kind of set you off, like it does with me all the freaking time. But my hope for this video is that by me talking about my experience as an urban fantasy reader reading these high fantasy books, some of the ones that you haven't picked up you'll be more motivated to by having someone who understands your mindset of how difficult it is to read high fantasy. And I don't really know what I'm saying. I thought this was a good idea for a video. I'm sorry if this is shit. One thing I do want to distinguish in this video is the difference between urban fantasy or contemporary fantasy and high fantasy, because it's something that I'm asked a lot when I just say the word urban fantasy. People are like, what is that? And I didn't even know what urban fantasy was until a couple of months ago, and I found the term and I was like, oh my god, someone put all the books I love into words. So the main difference between high fantasy and urban fantasy is really the location. The best way I can probably describe urban fantasy is that it takes place in like a modern day time, typically in like a large city. The general public don't really know about the supernatural fantasy world beneath it, and that's what kind of makes it that fantasy aspect. So kind of imagine it like today, it's 2016, I'm living in New York, like there could be this whole fantasy world that I have no idea about going on underneath me, that just all these adventures are having and all of these books could potentially be having without my knowledge. So examples of this to kind of put that in context would be like Harry Potter, The Mortal Instruments, Vampire Academy, Twilight. Those kind of books are all urban fantasy. And just to clarify something, I know I said it typically takes place in like a modern day time, but there are historical fiction urban fantasy novels. So for example, like Passenger is kind of historical fiction urban fantasy, The Infernal Devices, The Dark Days Club, those are still all urban fantasy even though it's not necessarily in a modern time. And so high fantasy is the total opposite, where the entire world is this fantasy world. So their history isn't like our modern day history that you'd find in an urban fantasy book, it's the fantasy world's history. There's a lot of world building, and it's just the fact that it takes place in like this alternate world that makes it the high fantasy. So think of books like Game of Thrones and The Lord of the Rings, where everything is fantasy and there's no general public. That's the best way to describe it, and while all of those explanations are over, I'm going to start talking to you guys about some of the books that are high fantasy that I think would be good recommendations for urban fantasy readers. The first on that list is Throne of Glass by Sarah J. Maas. Now, Throne of Glass is actually one of the first high fantasy books that I really ever read. I really loved the first one, but later as I was reading, the books kind of declined for me, and I feel like a lot of it has to do with the fact that this is the first experience I had with urban fantasy, and I just marathoned the first 3 books in this series, and I wasn't really totally getting this whole high fantasy thing, but I would still recommend it to absolutely anyone who's interested in trying out high fantasy. While it's not my favorite, anyone who loves Throne of Glass will tell you it just keeps getting better and better and better, and I totally understand the hype around it. I think a lot of the parts I don't like about this series are due to the fact that this is really my first exposure to high fantasy, and I just marathoned these first 3 books without really knowing what high fantasy was and stuff. So while it wasn't like the best reading experience, I do want to continue with this series, and I would absolutely recommend it to anyone who's interested in trying out high fantasy. Like, this should be one of your staple books as an urban fantasy reader who's trying to delve into high fantasy. How many times am I going to say fantasy in this video? Can somebody keep account for me? Because I've already said it like 25 times. Oh, I should probably give a synopsis too, right? That would help. Throne of Glass is all about this girl named Selena Sardathian, who is a well-known assassin in this world. Basically, she was captured and has been living in salt mines for a year when one of the king's men comes to her and says, hey, you're really good at killing people, why don't you join the king's kind of like competition to find his own personal assassin, and if you compete and if you win your freedom. So basically it's all about Selena, who goes to the king's castle and competes against all of these other men who are trying to get the same thing as her, and it's just a really interesting concept. I really loved Throne of Glass. I just wasn't a fan of the rest of the book so far, but definitely pick this up if you're looking to delve into high fantasy. So the next book I want to recommend to you guys is Shadow and Bone by Leigh Bardugo. I've actually only read the first one in this series. I haven't gotten around to finishing it, but I really loved Shadow and Bone, and I'm definitely planning on finishing the rest of the trilogy. Shadow and Bone is all about a girl named Alina who comes from this nation called Ravka, which is kind of like enveloped in this darkness that's slowly destroying the land. All of a sudden, Alina finds out that she's one of this world's elite called the Grisha, who are basically people with special powers, and she kind of is destined to kind of drive away that darkness that's destroying the land. So it's all about this girl Alina who's coming from like this lower class into the elite, learning how to use her powers and kind of facing up to all of the dangers that come along with that responsibility. While I have only read the first book in the series, I love this world. I think it's really great for people who are urban fantasy readers, because my friend Kelly from Kelly's Booksville, we buddy read it together, and she's just always saying, it's fantasy, it's high fantasy, but it reads like a contemporary. The writing is just super easy to understand, which is super important to me as a non-high fantasy reader, and I just really enjoyed the world. It definitely isn't the highest fantasy I've ever read, and I think that's why I really like it, and I would love to recommend it to you guys. If you haven't picked up Shadow and Bone, I would really recommend you do so, because I think that this is a book that a lot of people would love. So kind of related to Shadow and Bone, the next book I want to recommend is Six of Crows by Leigh Bardugo. This is kind of like a spin-off series to Shadow and Bone because it takes place in the same world. As someone who's just recently read this book and hasn't finished the Grisha trilogy, I can promise you, you don't need to finish it. They're two separate series completely. It's just the same world. I don't know the best way to describe it, but I can tell you that it is definitely not castles for Grisha. It's kind of like the slums for normal people without powers who don't like the Grisha. So Six of Crows is about this group of 6 different people from Ketterdam who were all brought together under this one mission to break this really important person out of jail. So it's basically like a heist novel with 6 completely different people all in it for different reasons, other than they all want this crazy amount of money that will make them rich beyond their wildest dreams. I definitely enjoyed Six of Crows much better than Shadow and Bone. Maybe it's just because I recently read this one and I read Shadow and Bone like a year ago, but I loved Six of Crows. It was so high intensity. It's the same thing like Shadow and Bone, where the writing isn't super complicated, which is something that's really associated with high fantasy in my opinion. I just think it was an all-around great novel, and I don't think it matters if you're an urban fantasy reader or a high fantasy reader. I think everyone who likes fantasy would enjoy Six of Crows, so I'd really recommend you pick it up. The next book I want to recommend to you guys is Red Queen by Victoria Aveyard. Red Queen is all about this world where it's kind of divided by blood. There are people with red blood who are the commoners, and then there are people with the silver blood who are like the elites that have special powers. And so in this world we have a girl named Mare who all of her life has believed that she has red blood, but in kind of a turn of events she finds out that she actually has silver blood, and so the silver-blooded people, they don't like that. So they pass her off as like this long-lost princess who's meant to marry like the prince, and so it's all about her being thrust into this world of magical powers that she never knew that she had, and this different lifestyle completely, and just bunch of crazy shit happens from there. Red Queen is another high fantasy that I didn't absolutely love. I predicted the ending, which kind of always ruins books for me, but it is definitely a really great book for people who are trying to delve more into high fantasy. A lot of people say that Red Queen is a very generic YA book, which I totally agree with, but I don't have a problem with generic YA. I think especially if you're going into a new genre, it's kind of better to have a lot of tropes and things that you're used to rather than an entirely different thing and kind of like flooding exposure for yourself with this new genre. So I think that anyone who is looking to get more into high fantasy but kind of wants to hold on to a lot of the things they love about urban fantasy, Red Queen will definitely be a really good choice for you. I know this is like a really long video, but I had a lot to talk about in the beginning, so just stick with me guys, we only got like 3 more books to go. The next book I want to recommend to you guys is Truthwitch by Susan Dennard. I recently read Truthwitch. This is a book that I was super excited for. It didn't occur to me until I started reading that it was high fantasy. So this is one of those books where I started reading and I'm like, ah shit, this is high fantasy. I'm not gonna like this book, but I loved it. Truthwitch is absolutely fantastic. Everyone needs to read it. Our main character, Safi, is a Truthwitch, which means she can tell when somebody is lying or telling the truth, and that makes her one of the rarest witches in the entire world. So Truthwitch is all about Safi and her friend Isolt, who is a Threadwitch who can basically see like the different bonds between other people. It's all about them kind of running from basically everyone in this world. Like, everyone wants to get their hands on a Truthwitch for their own personal gain, because what can't you do if you can tell when somebody's lying or telling? So it's just about their journey together and about them trying to escape all the different clutches that Safi is trying to be brought into, and it's just an epic story and it's fantastic. Even though I had like that split-second realization that this is a high fantasy novel, I didn't notice it throughout the rest of the book just because the plot and the characters were so intriguing that it didn't really matter what genre it was. Truthwitch is just so good. Oh my god, everyone read it. It was so good. Please read it. It's like a must for all fantasy readers. The next book recommendation I have for you guys is A Court of Thorns and Roses by Sarah J. Maas. Now, I previously said that I wasn't a big fan of the Throne of Glass series, and so I hesitated to pick up Court of Thunder and Roses for quite some time. I was like, I didn't like it. Like, I don't know. I didn't like high fantasy. I don't know if it's that I don't like her writing. I don't know if it was I didn't like the story. Just going through a whole lot of internal conflict while trying to decide if I wanted to read this book. So I actually ended up picking it up on audiobook, and I just immediately became obsessed. Immediately. The second it started, I was like, holy shit, I'm done. I'm done, guys. I love this so much. It's one of those books that's just so good that you just want to stroke it, because oh my god. So Court of Thorns and Roses is actually a retelling of Beauty and the Beast centered in this high fantasy world. Basically, the premise of this world is that like the normal humans live in like this little sector, and then you have the fairy lands that are like over here, and like they do their best not to interact. And so our main character, Farah, is hunting in the woods to provide for her family when she accidentally kills a wolf that happens to be a fairy prince. And so one of the other fairy princes comes in and is like, hey, you killed my brother. I'm either going to kill you or your entire family, or you're going to come live in the fairylands for the rest of your life. And so Farah, being the noble person that she is, she goes into the fairylands, and it's kind of like, you know how Beauty and the Beast, she's forced into this world, being the beauty, and then the beast comes and they fall in love. But she's oh my god, does this book go in like 17 million directions you're not gonna expect. I loved A Court of Thorns and Roses. This is another one where I was just reading it, and I was consciously aware of the fact that this is an urban fantasy, and like it does have the high fantasy feel to it. It wasn't the main thing I was focusing on, which is a problem I have a lot while reading high fantasy, and it was just everything I could ask for in a high fantasy novel for an urban fantasy reader like myself. I don't know how I put down this book for so long. It was so good. Sarah J. Maas is a fantastic writer. Like, reading this book made me really realize that I love Sarah J. Maas as a writer. I'm just not a big fan of Throne of Glass at the moment. I think if I were to reread Throne of Glass, I would like it more. But for the time being, I'm just in love with A Court of Thorns and Roses. And if you haven't read it, what the fuck are you doing? This book is amazing. Please read it. And so the final book that I want to recommend to you guys for high fantasy reads for urban fantasy readers is actually The Hobbit by J.R.R. Tolkien. I know I said before that like I wasn't a big fan of like the Lord of the Rings and whatnot. I did read The Fellowship of the Ring, and I really, really enjoyed the book. It took me so long to read, and it had all of the aspects that I don't like about high fantasy, even though I really, really loved the book, so I didn't want to include it in here. But I think The Hobbit would be a really, really great fit for people who are especially looking for that high fantasy thing. Now, backtracking myself now, I know that The Hobbit is actually the very first experience I had with high fantasy. So I'm jumping in from reading The Mortal Instruments for like 6 months. It's the only books I read, and then all of a sudden I'm reading The Hobbit. Let me tell you, it was a transition. But I had seen the Hobbit movies before, so I had an idea of what the story was, and like I really, really love the Hobbit movies. But I had read the book, and I definitely would recommend this to someone who's especially like working their way up to higher fantasy. Now, while this book may look big, and I know J.R.R. Tolkien is a very dense writer, it's less than 300 pages. So while it did take me longer than most books to read, even though it was one of the shorter books that I read, I just really, really enjoyed it. It's a great epic fantasy tale, and I think that everyone can appreciate that about The Hobbit. Maybe you want to do what I did and maybe even just watch the first movie first, because there's 3 movies made out of this tiny ass book. But if you want to just watch the first one and then decide if you want to read The Hobbit, highly would recommend it. There are differences, but I really, really loved The Hobbit. The Hobbit is definitely one of the best written fantasy books of all time, in my opinion. And so, you know, I wouldn't recommend this maybe as your very first read on this list. But if you read a couple and you're like, I want to push myself a little bit, I want to challenge myself to read something that's a little bit higher fantasy, definitely go for The Hobbit, and then decide later if you want to read Lord of the Rings or Game of Thrones, or those are really the only 2 examples I have. But there's a lot more out there that I definitely need to work up to. But these are all of the books that I would recommend if you're just starting out or kind of in the middle of this high fantasy journey like myself. So that is really it for this video. I really hope someone got something out of it. I know I'm talking about a lot of very popular books, but I can only hope that like telling you guys my experience of reading them and like what I liked about them, even though they would possibly motivate some of you to pick something up that you weren't really crazy about before. If you guys have any high fantasy recommendations, please leave them below, because I'm always looking for new books to try. I know Mistborn isn't on this list. I have Mistborn. I haven't read it yet, but I know a ton of people are going to recommend it, and that's probably going to be my next high fantasy read. I don't really have any planned at the moment, but when I'm looking to read high fantasy again, that's definitely going to be my first choice. So please recommend some high fantasy books to me, and if you really got anything out of this video, I'd really, really appreciate knowing, because I'm like nervous posting this and be like, everyone has read all these books, everyone knows what there's about, everyone loves them. This video was pointless. That's how I feel right now. So if you have anything positive to say, I'd really appreciate it. That's it for this video. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you soon for a new one. Bye!